Hi guys, welcome back for another painting tutorial. Now if you were tuning in last week, you know that we painted sort of an upper class Elizabethan era soldier, and you got to see he had quite a gaudy, brightly colored ornate uniform. And this week we're going to be doing another period that is famous for being gaudy and ornate, and if you can see that book behind me, then you already know that we're going to be doing Napoleonics again. Now this week I wanted to choose something that I thought would be practical a little bit. I mean, in general, Napoleonics, they're all kind of fancy and over the top, but some less so than others. So while I was very tempted to go for some sort of crazy kind of cavalry officer type model, which would have been really fun for me to paint, maybe it wouldn't have been so useful for you. So instead, I have opted for this guy. He is a officer of the light infantry. Yeah, it's still an officer, but I know that in general infantry uniforms were a little bit more conservative, and they are probably, for people building their Napoleonic armies, a little bit more useful because you need to paint tons of these guys. And, you know, I can see how just learning these uniforms is a little more valuable. So anyway, this sculpt is, not surprisingly, by Perry, since they've got one of the biggest and most comprehensive and best Napoleonic ranges out there. I have already base coated him, as you can see, and painted the skin. And yeah, he is French, so that's no surprise, really, is it? Well, it could have been English. Yeah, I do want to do an English Napoleonic or German or Prussian or something else at some point, but at this moment, pretty much all the Napoleonic units I have are French, so that's what it's going to be for the foreseeable future. But I think you should still find this really useful, hopefully. It's going to be a lot of painting blue, and I actually haven't done so much where I really paint a really solidly blue uniform, so hopefully that will be interesting to you. So why don't we go ahead and get started. Alright, so let's start out by base coating our uniform, and as I mentioned before, this particular figure is a great study in blue because his pants are blue, his jacket is blue, he's really just really blue all over, and the color I'm going to be using for this is the Foundry French Blue Triad. Very logical, right? So to get started, I am just going to apply a nice even base coat of the French blue shade all over the uniform, down in all of the recesses. And don't worry too much about covering areas that have to be another color later. It'll just be easier if you overpaint at this stage rather than try to avoid areas, because it's much easier to, go back over than try to fix areas that you didn't paint blue that did need to be that color. And then very logically, I'm going to be moving on to the French blue medium color. And as you can see, this is really going to want to go all over almost all of the uniform. There's very few areas that you want to really leave that French blue shade color, only with the exceptions being sort of borders and recesses around the edges of a piece of clothing, seams, stuff like that. And there actually are a lot of seams in this uniform, so make sure you're careful when you're painting that you leave those the dark color. We really only want that shade color to be showing through in areas where we want sort of a lining effect, a sort of a contrast. But you can, otherwise this medium color is going to want to go everywhere. And if you come into some areas with deep folds, you may want to blend it out a little bit there, just so it's not quite so bright. But that's about it, really. When it comes to the French blue light shade, at this point you do want to start being a little bit more selective about where you apply it. So you can see that I'm really focusing it now on the tops of creases and folds, on knees and elbows, those usual spots where you'd expect there to be more light hitting. But I am going to blend it out a little bit. I'm going to apply it a little bit thinly, and I'm going to then build up a couple of layers on those areas that are the sort of those light areas that I just described. And you can see I'm also going to be running it along the edges of all those seams. There's quite a few of them in the back of the jacket and along its pants, and you want to be really careful, pay close attention to those, because they really make the difference between a sort of a meh figure and a more interesting, detailed looking one. I'm then going to continue highlighting further by taking some deep blue light from Foundry and mixing that in with the French blue light color. It's going to be about a 50-50 mix here with probably, well, maybe more 75-25, I don't know. But definitely you can see there's going to be more of that deep blue in there. And you can see now that I'm going to be applying that pretty generously again, but also fairly thinly, so that I don't get too carried away. As I've made it definitely brighter here, but I've not made it really, really dramatically brighter than the color I had before, and I am feathering it out a lot. So you can go ahead now and just start applying that over your highest creases and stuff. And I'm doing it particularly there, you can see on the backs of the pans, which wrinkle quite a bit. And definitely as an edging color for all of those, once again, for all of those seams, which are really, really important to emphasize, as I've said before. And then I'm finally going to just finish this up with just some pure deep blue light, thin, fairly well down, and this really is only going to go on along the seam edges and around the cuffs and the bottoms of the pants and where in those kinds of places. You really should apply it quite sparingly because we don't want the uniform to get too bright blue here. So yeah, don't overdo it. Now, a really major element of this uniform is going to be the white piping, which sort of goes around the front of the jacket, around the cuffs, and around the collar, and of course down at the back to his tails. It's really critical that you do this neatly, that you do it carefully, because basically something like this, a detail like this, is really going to make or break how your whole uniform ends up looking. I am using Foundry Stone Light here as a base coat for the piping areas, and you need to get it nice and thin so it flows and you can easily paint these fine lines. You can see how I'm taking it along the back of his turnbacks and all of those sorts of areas, and just being very, very careful how I do this. Once I have finished with that, then I will only be using one highlight color. The trick is here with that sort of using a slightly sort of darker shade of gray. I can then go ahead and work the white over top of it and not need more shades. With something this fine, you really only probably need to be working with two colors. And here I am now indeed applying that white, and I'm just going back over the lines I already started. Having that gray there adds a little bit of dimensionality to these sort of pieces of piping. Plus, at areas where it goes under something or goes into extreme shadows, you can kind of blend the white out into the color you already had. Now you can also see I'm painting some details on his turnbacks. These light infantry men had sort of little hunting horn embroideries there, and it's very difficult. There's not much room here. It's difficult at this scale. So I've just kind of painted some kind of little tiny circles and then putting a little blue dot in the middle with sort of bits sticking off of either end. It's kind of vague. It doesn't really matter. And in fact, you could probably skip this step because even though they were there, it's hard to make them look decent at this scale. So it's definitely one of those details you could decide not to worry about. I'm now going to be painting his collar, which is red. I'm base coating it here using Vallejo Black Red first, and then I'm going to highlight it first with the Citadel Mephista Red, followed by a really nice bright layer of Evil Sun's Scarlet. The reason I'm doing this now is because the collar also has white piping around the top and sort of going down the front, so I want to really quickly take care of it so that I can also apply the white piping here before my paint dries up. So I'm trying to work a little bit smart. So once the collar is painted red, I'm just going to be painting the piping in exactly the same way I did before. In other words, I'm going to put down that stone light color as a base very carefully around the top and going down the front, and then I'm going to apply white over the top. Now, once I finish with the piping, I'm going to go and do a little bit of cleanup work because there's going to be areas where the piping, if it's a little bit too thick or uneven or whatever. So the way I like to clean that up, and a great way to add extra emphasis to the piping is to sort of line it, especially in certain areas, with a darker color. So for example, with this collar, once I've painted the trim on it, I'm going to take the Vallejo black red really thin and make a very fine line around the bottom, just sort of line it, which will give it that extra emphasis, the extra dimensionality. It'll make it look a lot neater. And I'll do the same thing on the jacket, but then I'll be using the French blue shade color for that, and it just gives a slightly neater effect. It makes your lines look sharper, more even. I just generally recommend it if you have time, you want to put the effort in. If you really, especially with a uniform like this where the piping and the look of the piping is really critical to the success of the figure, you should really, use all of these tricks to make sure you get a good result. Now I'm going to move on to the black areas on this figure, and because he's a light infantry officer, most of the leather pieces of his equipment are black. So you can see here I'm base coating his shoes, his scabbard, which he's holding, his neck stock, which is kind of underneath his collar there, and also the brim of his hat. His hat has a cover on it, and we're going to paint that separately in a nice contrasting color, but I want to take care of that right now. He's also got sort of a belt on that's holding up his sword, a scabbard still. You can see it kind of in places, and then going around his front. And you're also going to want to make sure you base coat that. And then it's time to highlight the black leather areas. I'm starting out here with good old Vallejo German gray. It's a good bluish dark gray shade that's a great starting point for this. So it's going to go pretty much everywhere, and I'm going to blend it out a little bit, but it's going to be applied fairly generously to all of these black leather areas. And my next highlight is going to be a mix of that German gray and a bit of the stone light color that I already had laying around. And you can see I'm using this now more for emphasis on the sort of the edges of the leather and sort of blending it out. You'll see that particularly on the scabbard. I'm painting it along the top there and sort of blending it downward so we still keep some of that dark color. I'll then highlight some very select areas like the edge of his hat bill, the very top of that scabbard, the tips of his shoes, using just pure stone light, just very lightly, not too much of this because it's quite a bright color. I'm also going to then take some peaty brown, which is a color also from Foundry, which I thinned down quite a bit. You want it fairly transparent. I'm going to use that here to very sort of lightly highlight the tips of his shoes, get a little bit of brown into the leather. And you can put that in a few other areas if you want, just to make the leather more interesting, make it look like the black finish is worn off a bit and get a sort of slightly interesting cast here and there. And now I'm going to be painting his hat cover and the strap holding on his drinking gourd. Now these hat covers were sometimes black or gray, but they were also brown, and I decided it might be more interesting in this case to make it brown because it gives a nice contrast with the rest of the uniform with the blues and grays, and the brown is going to be a nice, slightly warmer color. So I'm just applying the rawhide shade color here as a base coat for those sections. And then really quickly, to get some extra shading in the recess, especially on that hat, I'm going to apply a generous wash of Agrax Earth shade. To highlight those brown areas, I'm going to just be taking first the rawhide medium color and applying that pretty much everywhere. On the hat cover, of course, you want to stay away from the darkened edges and recesses that you've created with the wash. So leave those areas dark so you get some good definition, but I'm applying it mostly everywhere else. I'm blending it out just a little tiny bit. And with the rawhide light, I'm going to be just a little bit more sparing with it. I'm applying it especially sort of as an edge highlight, sort of, and then blending it down from there. On the top, I'm even going to sort of apply some kind of stripes, blended stripes across the top to give it a little more indication of texture and, fabric there. And then, of course, on the strap, you just apply it sort of to the top and sort of middle areas. I'm also going to be base coating the drinking gourd itself with the rawhide light shade. and I'll be going on and highlighting it more with some other colors in a minute, but I want to sort of just get that base there because gourds are always kind of a yellowy brown color. I'm now going to continue working on the gourd. I'm applying a very light coat of boneyard shade to it to get a kind of a more yellowish cast to it. You can kind of apply it in a little sort of mottled, blotchy way because gourds are kind of mottled and blotchy looking. And then I'm going to take the boneyard medium, continuing, and apply that again, highlighting it, but also again sort of seeing I'm going to be making it a little bit uneven looking. And while I've got that boneyard medium out, I'm going to add another extra high highlight sort of on his strap and along the edges only, really only an edge highlight this time, of his hat, just to add extra emphasis and get more contrast there. I'll then finish off with the boneyard light, though I'm not going to be putting that on his hat. That's really only going to be used as a sort of a final highlight on the gourd, but then really don't put too much on, keep it thin, and once again sort of blotch it out to get that sort of natural finish you'd expect on a pumpkin or a squash or a gourd. Now I'm starting on the steel and silver areas of his uniform, which include his sword blade, his buttons, and of course his epaulets. His epaulets are kind of silver and they're a little special case. I'll get to that in a minute. But of course with the sword and the buttons, it's pretty straightforward. I've taken a mix of German gray and Vallejo Air steel, made a really nice dark base color, and I'm going to apply it actually just to all of those areas just to start out. Then in order to highlight the blade particularly, I'm going to take steel and then also the German gray, but a much brighter mix, so a lot less in that case of the German gray, and use that as sort of a first highlight on the blade. So you can see I'm emphasizing the front cutting surface and blending it back. And then you can finish by just taking pure steel and running that along the cutting edge of the blade just to get that extra sharp edge. And then I'm taking Vallejo Air silver, and I'm going to use that to highlight all of his buttons. You only need 2 colors on such small areas, so you can just base coat them and then go ahead and apply the silver accent. His epaulet's a little bit of a different matter. They are silver, but they're sort of made of silver thread that's been woven together, and it looks a little bit different than just a piece of metal would. So in order to do that, what I've done here is I've taken Vallejo silver gray, which is kind of a light white silver color, but it's not metallic, and I've base coated the epaulettes with that. And then what I'm going to do is apply a Nuln Oil wash over that, and that's mostly just to get some darker colors kind of down in the recesses there and define better the tassels and stuff. Next, I'm going to take just pure white, which I thinned a bit, and I'm going to use that to highlight those epaulettes along all of the edges and all of the braiding and stuff. Get that white there. And now finally, and this is the important part, I'm going to take the Vallejo Air silver and I'm going to thin it down very, 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 very far. In other words, I'm going to make it into a wash. And it has to be quite thin because these colors are extremely pigmented, these metallic colors. And if you don't thin them down even more than you think, you're going to have too much of the metallic in there and it won't look good. So after you make that wash, then go ahead and apply it really generously all over the epaulettes. And probably you're going to want to do it in several layers here, and that's going to add this metallic kind of gleam, kind of sparkle to the epaulettes. Plus it's going to help even further emphasize the recesses in those pieces. So that's why we're doing that here. So we're basically creating a white thing but then adding the metallic in later. I'm going to follow the steel and silver areas up with the bronze and gold areas, as you might expect, which are going to include the handle and guard on his saber, and then also the fittings on his scabbard, and of course his gorget, which he's wearing around his neck, which is a nice gold color. I'm base coating all of these areas as usual with a mix of Vallejo German camouflage black brown and some Vallejo Air gold. I've made a nice dark brown metallic shade as my kind of first base coat. Continuing on from there, I'll take just the plain old Vallejo Air gold and I'll use it to highlight those areas a little bit to get them more shiny. And on the sword and scabbard, that's really sufficient. The gorget I want to be a little more gold, a little bit more shiny and polished. So what I'm going to do there is I'm going to highlight it first with the gold, and then I'm going to apply an Agrex Earthshade wash to it, which will help unify the colors a little bit, but also get some extra dimension and contrast in the sort of the recesses, because it's got sort of an edging piece around it. And then to finish that off, I will take Vallejo Air Silver and mix it in with the gold to get a high highlight color, as I've done before. It's a great way to highlight those really areas that you want to be really bright gold, but of course don't put too much on. So I'm just going to very subtly apply that around sort of the edges, sort of very much in the middle of the gorget piece where it bulges out. And just, you can see I'm also putting a little on the sword and scabbard too, but just a tiny bit, and it'll go a really long way here. The last detail to take care of is the pom-pom on top of his hat. This is very straightforward. I'm just going to base coat it with the Vallejo Black Red. Then I'm going to apply a highlight of the Mephiston Red from Citadel, blending it down towards the base so we keep some of the dark color down there. And then finally finish off by taking the Evil Sunz Scarlet for a really nice, brilliant, extreme highlight on the very, very top of that pom-pom area. All right, here is our French Napoleonic light infantry officer. He has a fairly simple uniform, as you saw. There weren't a lot of components to it, not a lot we had to worry about, but it was a classic example of where if you're doing something simple like this, it's extra important that you do a neat, careful job to get good results. And that's especially true here with this white piping. You need to really put the time in to get good results on these types of uniforms, because if you don't paint it neatly, the whole thing is going to look bad. You're going to spoil the whole effect. So I hope you found at least the way that I showed here how to do it was reasonably approachable. And also, I hope you found some use in how I paint blue. I think it turned out really nice. I think it's a very pretty color, and I really like how it contrasts here with the white piping. So if you enjoyed this video, as usual, please like it, share it with your friends, and do leave me comments, as always, about what you thought. And of course, suggestions for new videos are very much appreciated. I always need those. I'm always looking for ideas, maybe some more interesting or different periods that maybe I haven't thought of yet. And also, of course, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, because, hey, it's nice to keep up with what I'm doing. At least I hope that you think it's nice to keep up with what I'm doing, and you can see my videos as soon as they come out. So I will see you next week, and until then, happy painting.